One thing that I liked about what Brecka said, even though he did a shit job of explaining it, was about rethinking how we think of diseases that are passed on genetically in families. What he's really trying to say is that we pass down the predisposition to these diseases being diagnosed because we pass on functional abilities or the lack of these functional abilities or the reduced functional ability to metabolize certain nutrients, like, for example, methylating B vitamins and folate. I think that's accurate. I think that's true. I think that's a very good point, and a great way of thinking about our genetic diseases, so to speak, or many of them anyways, particularly those around that we know are related to diet and lifestyle. What Brecka completely forgets about with regards to homocysteine, though, when he starts to talk a lot more about homocysteine and methylation and starts to reduce. It seems like he wants to reduce everything down to 5 gene variants or 5 SNPs that we have in our DNA. And he starts to oversimplify here. And so when he starts talking about homocysteine, it's important for everybody to understand that, and what Brecka doesn't explain is that homocysteine is a precursor to glutathione. Glutathione is the most important, most powerful antioxidant that your body produces endogenously. And its job is to protect against oxidative stress, oxidative damage, free radicals. It is not just an important nutrient, but it is an essential nutrient, homocysteine, in that way. And so it's very important for us to be able to produce homocysteine. But what we do need to be able to do is to unplug the bottleneck in order to push homocysteine metabolism through to glutathione, or as he talks about, recycle it back into methionine and cysteine, its component parts, or to produce SAMe, which he talks about later on in the podcast as well. So yes, homocysteine is an oxidative stress. It is an inflammatory stress on our arteries, systemically in our body, and bioaccumulation of homocysteine in an individual is an individual risk factor for cardiovascular disease and other chronic diseases as well, specifically heart disease, cardiovascular disease events like heart attack and stroke. It is an independent risk factor. We know that at this point from the last 15 years of research. But when he's insinuating that we need to completely get off or get rid of homocysteine and recycle all of it back into its component parts of cysteine and methionine, that process is facilitated by methylated B12, B6, folic acid, and another nutrient called trimethylglycine, sometimes referred to as TMG. And he talks about that. Now, TMG is also referred to as betaine, so you may see that in some of your supplements already without even realizing it. But if you want to lower homocysteine, those are the 4 most important nutrients to be thinking about, especially from a supplemental standpoint. And if I'm being honest, that's really old science. I mean, even before I graduated med school, so this is over 15 years ago, I did some work for a professional line nutraceutical company, and they started their company really a decade before that even, so 25 years ago, on the strength of a single product designed to lower cardiovascular disease risk. And guess what was in it? Methylated B6, B12, folate, and trimethylglycine, TMG. And so Brecka kind of completely disregards B6 and 12 and folate in the discussion because TMG is new, or frankly, it's and more accurately, it's old and forgotten, and people don't know as much about it these days. But the bottom line here is my point is you can't and you shouldn't just be taking TMG as a single supplement thinking that's going to be the game changer for homocysteine. You really want a combination of TMG, B6, B12, and folic acid or folate. And this will provide you with the nutrients that you need to optimize that homocysteine cycle and not just focus on getting rid of homocysteine, but also converting it into glutathione, facilitating that production of a very important antioxidant in our body. So further to that, Brecka then goes on and says, look, everyone should do a genetic methylation test. Yeah, no shit. And he identifies MTHFR, MTR, MTRR genetic SNPs. He later goes on to talk about COMT, COMT, as a gene that we should be looking at as well. I'll address that in a second. And what he's really talking about is assessing for specific SNPs, SNPs. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphisms. And we can go into this in a little bit more depth in another video, perhaps. But in the days after this podcast went live, I saw so many people and have heard about so many people and have gotten questions from patients about DNA testing for these 5 4 or 5 genetic markers that Brecka mentioned on Rogan's podcast. And it's driving me bonkers because that's just 5 tests amongst hundreds that we know enough about that we can make some clinical decisions on. And literally, I was on Amazon the other day looking at this, and the result of this podcast is that people are now selling tests for 1 or 2 or 5 of these methylation genes specifically, and ignoring all the other information that we can get from your functional genetic tests and screens. And they're selling them for hundreds of dollars on Amazon. So people are really getting ripped off, and that really pisses me off. I mean, you can get entire functional genetic screens at this point. So the one that I often use it looks at over 130 different SNPs across over 90 different genes. It includes all the genes that Brecka talks about, which are frankly some of the oldest news in functional medicine. Literally, functional genetics blew up right as I was coming out of med school about 15 years ago. We were talking about homocysteine and methylated folate and MTHFR at that point. It was brand new science at that point. It is 15 years later, and we are so far past just methylation and MTHFR and MTR and MTRR. There is so much more information to be had. So to spend hundreds of dollars on just 1 or 5 of these methylation genes is just crazy. Look, MTHFR, the motherfucker gene, as we like to call it, it was the first functional genetic SNP that really caught our attention in the scientific literature, probably because its abbreviation is awesome. But if you try to isolate 1 or even 3 or 5 gene variants only in one physiological pathway of your body, you're being just as reductionistic as and short-sighted as 99% of other doctors out there. So it really drives me bonkers that that's what he's insinuating, whether he meant to or not. So that's my little rant on what he talked about in terms of homocysteine and methylation. I will say, though, I did like Brecka's statement. Let me read it here. It's astounding what happens to human beings when you give the body the raw materials it needs to do its job. And then he goes on and says, supplementing for the sake of supplementing, that's missing the point. And I would agree. Supplementing for the sake of supplementing is like below rookie level thinking. But I would go a step further than what he talked about and say, yes, we should be supplementing for nutrient deficiencies that we can assess in comprehensive blood work, firstly. And that's part of what Brecka talks about. But we can also utilize functional genetic testing to provide us with a literal blueprint or an instruction manual for how our brain and bodies are designed to function at their best. This is, just one example of how we can really use functional genetics to create precision medicine or individualized medicine, personalized medical plans, specific and unique to our own DNA. So some of us don't methylate folate and don't methylate B vitamins readily. We can bypass that process by consuming methylated folate and B vitamins. And this will be important for those approximately 40% of the population who have some level of gene variant that is associated with poor methylation. For other people who might have great methylation genes, but might have a gene variant somewhere else, like BCM01, the people who have gene variants of BCM01 may or may not be able to convert beta carotene from the diet from our colorful vegetables into vitamin A. And so this is why they would likely have a higher predisposition to things like skin disorders or acne and vision problems or immune system issues, having difficulty fighting off the average virus, maybe making them more likely to catch some of the upper respiratory infections that are going around these days, let's just say. So just one example and one small area of medicine that we need to be looking at. And I didn't like how Brecka tried to reduce everything to methylation and MTHFR. It kind of reminded me of 15 years ago when methylation was the hot topic and everyone was saying like, oh, this is the thing. And everyone's health depends on this one gene, MTHFR. We're so far past that. Get over it. It drives me bonkers. What else did he talk about? Oh, he talked about postpartum depression. So yes, methylfolate is really important for the prevention of neural tube defects, but Brecka is really sensationalist on this one. And he insinuates that women shouldn't take folic acid. And so I get what he's saying. There's some level of truth and correctness in what he's saying here. What he's trying to say is that we need to be able to activate folate into methylfolate and That's the nutrient form that is actually used by the body that prevents neural tube defects, etc. But that does not mean that pregnant women shouldn't be taking folic acid in general. And it does not mean that folic acid supplements won't prevent neural tube defects. Decades of very good research show that folic acid prevents neural tube defects. But we do need to recognize that some women will benefit from using supplements that contain activated methylfolate because they don't convert folic acid from food and crappy supplements as readily. That doesn't mean they can't or don't. It just means they do a poorer job of it. Maybe they need a higher dose of folic acid to prevent those kinds of outcomes from happening, to compensate for that functional genetic insufficiency. Or they can supplement with the ideal form, bypassing their genetic mutation, which is what Brecka is talking about. More importantly, though, to suggest that postpartum depression is reduced to just a methylation issue is just stupid. And this is what happens when non-clinical, non-practicing people start to try to tell people how to figure out their health and medical stuff. Anemia, iron deficiency, functional B12 insufficiencies. These are huge underlying nutrient deficiencies that are probably even more prominent, but at least as prominent or important as methylation when it comes to postpartum depression. Please don't reduce postpartum depression to just one thing in methylation and say that that's the cause. Same thing when he goes and talks about ADD or ADHD and behavior and our thought processes and stuff like that, to just reduce it to one or two genes. That's like 2009 education when it comes to functional genetics. And again, I'm just disappointed and saddened that was sort of the impression that he was giving on the podcast. One thing I did want to bring up was Brecka. He only briefly mentioned COMT a couple of times throughout the episode. COMT is one of the other few gene variants that Brecka talks about possibly getting tested for. You can't look at COMT by itself. Again, super beginner level biohacking bullshit idiocy here. The COMT gene codes for an enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters, including dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. He says this stuff. He's right about that stuff. This particular gene is a really popular one, kind of like the MTHFR gene. It probably gets a lot of attention from meathead biohackers because it's called the warrior gene, or one version of it is called the warrior gene. If you have two copies of the faster gene variant for this COMT gene in your DNA, you break down neurotransmitters more quickly. You'll experience less pain than those with other gene variants. And so historically, this made you a better warrior, let's say in Paleolithic times. And there is a mental component to this as well. So people with homozygous, so two good copies or fast copies of this particular gene, if you have the warrior gene, you are going to be better and more productive and perform better under pressure and under high stress. These are people in school who probably, procrastinated and then studied for 10 hours leading right up to an exam, probably pulled an all-nighter and then killed the exam the next day. They're the kinds of people that you would probably want leading a unit into war because they are not going to crack under pressure. And there are advantages and disadvantages to this. And I will talk more about COMT, I think, in the warrior gene in another video. I don't want this to get too convoluted and too diluted in this particular video. But the breakdown of dopamine and other neurotransmitters is just part of the issue. You also need to know that, neurotransmitters are like hormones. They're dependent on receptors on your cells in order for our body to recognize and to actually take action on the fact that, hey, there is a neurotransmitter, a chemical here in the blood. So as long as with COMT, you also look at other gene variants in DRD2 and ANKK1, for instance. These are at the very minimum when we're talking about mental health and the function of the breakdown of dopamine and other neurotransmitters. You can't just look at COMT. You got to look at COMT in relation to at least those other two gene variants. And each of these particular genes, there are multiple SNPs in each of these genes that at this point we know have some level of effect or outcomes in terms of functional changes to how our body processes neurotransmitters in this case. So what's, some of what Brecka says is true and correct. But he oversimplifies and generalizes recommendations here to the general public without an understanding of precision medicine and how to individualize based on the context of the unique situation of any individual or specific person. So I was a little bit saddened and disappointed to see this from Brecka because I really wanted to like him. But like I said earlier, this is what happens when people who don't have clinical medical training or experience start trying to use science to give generalized medicine and health advice. So for me, this podcast episode, Joe Rogan, was a single face palm. I really got excited, and then it kind of felt like getting blue balled when I actually started listening to it. If you guys want to do functional genetic testing, please get a test done that does more than just the 5 genes that Brecka talks about. It's a waste of your money otherwise. Why are we trying to reduce people's health and our DNA to 5 single genes when we can test over at this point, and in months and in years to come, this number will increase. But right now, we can test over 130 different SNPs across usually around 90 different genes. And those numbers, as I said, are growing in terms of what we have good scientific and clinical data on that we can actually apply for the development of precision medicine programs. Look, there's a ton more that Brecka goes into about later in the podcast, but I really wanted to address some of the things that he talks about early in the podcast, where he's really, whether he meant to be or not, where he really is being misleading, or at least not giving people really good information about homocysteine, methylation, B vitamins, folic acid, postpartum depression, COMT, neurotransmitter degradation. So come on, Brecka, Rogan, come on, be better. Okay, so I'm sure some of you will have more questions about this stuff, so please don't hesitate to shoot those questions, comments, or criticisms into the comments section here. If you were really thinking about testing the 5 genetic markers that Brecka talks about, but would rather not be ripped off and would like to have that done by a reputable lab, you can certainly connect with me and we can schedule a brief strategy session call. I'll leave a description or a link in the description. And depending on where you are located, I can probably facilitate a functional genetic screen. And again, we will look at over 130 single nucleotide polymorphisms across about 90 different genes. And after your test results, I'll unpack it with you in a coaching session. Please, please, please hit the subscribe button. It helps me keep motivated to continue to unpack podcasts like this and to create content that is clinically relevant and applicable in the real world for real people on an individualized basis so that we can be the most superhuman versions of ourselves and do awesome things and make the world a more awesome place